Our first speaker is Sarah Labrys, and she is a French lesbian, radical feminist, and co-founder of Resistance Lesbienne. And she's going to talk about the political situation in France and what it means for radical feminism. So thank you so much, Sarah, for coming on, and over to you.
Hello, thank you for having me on this panel today. I will be happy to bring maybe some clarification for the women who've heard the chaotic situation in France over the past month. We've never been as close to getting a far right-wing government. It's been avoided from very closely, and it's probably only temporary, but yeah, it's been quite of a mess. But yeah, before the talk, I can clarify my positionality, let's say, because I entered the debate on transgenderism from the UK as a lesbian radical feminist in 2017. I've done a lot of work with Get the Hell Out. And I've since moved back to France, where I lived, and I co-created Resistance Lesbienne with other women 3 years ago. And my position has always been that trans activism must be fought against from a radical feminist angle, which has always meant for me to categorically refuse any proximity with right-wing and far right-wing politics who can co-opt our themes, especially when it comes to the fight against trans ideology. And I think France, especially like these days, with what's been happening, is really an example of the plurality of traps we must avoid as radical feminists. And I've really felt this plurality of traps also as a lesbian who was in a country that almost shifted to a far right-wing government. So yeah, like the patriarchal context of male politics is composed of nuances of male domination and different forces of male domination that compete with each other. And we really feel when we're radical feminists that we do not face a single-headed enemy, but a kind of hydra, like a monster with several heads. And consequently, I have found, especially in the French context, that it's practically impossible to lead single-issue campaign. And that includes the campaign for the protection of women's rights against trans activism, because in the context of such a strong force from the far right, we are very vulnerable to being co-opted. And yeah, like the words of Audre Lorde, who said, like, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. I've really felt it over the past months in France. So I can just take a few minutes to explain maybe what's been happening in France. So after the European elections that we, like all of the European Union countries had early June, the two far-right parties, because in France now we have two far-right parties. We don't have only one, we have two. One is even worse than the other, let's say, but both are terrible, as I'll show you later. So both of those parties, they got almost 40% of the vote, 40%. Like there was a lot of people who didn't go to vote, but out of the people who voted, it's 40% who voted for openly far-right parties. And Macron, the current government, current president, sorry, his party arrived only second, but really far behind. And so Macron, just in case you don't know, like he got elected in France as a president in 2017, and then again in 2022. Initially he presented himself as a center politician, but yeah, of course, like he ended up like leading a lot of right-wing economic and social policies on a lot of levels. So he's really like center-right let's say, kind of politics. His party kind of exploded the usual dual, like two-party system, that we had in France, like in the UK, like Tories, Labour. Like the arrival of Macron has completely like exploded the traditional left-wing and traditional right-wing parties. So yeah, like after those European elections, he decided to dissolve the National Assembly, which was a huge surprise for a lot of people. I mean, when I heard that, I was completely like, flabbergasted, because no one was expecting that. I mean, there was rumors. It's been a while. It had been a while that there was rumors that he was going to do it, because especially since his second election at the National Assembly, he didn't have an absolute majority, which meant that he had to ally with a bit of other parties at Parliament to, especially to vote, for example, the state budget. And voting the state budget is coming in October, and there was some rumors that he was going to do it before that, because he's not really happy that he can't just do whatever he wants. And he was quite sadistic about this dissolution. Like, honestly, like a lot of people and a lot of feminists, like, we really felt that we had a kind of psychopathic ruler in front of us, because he said something like about the dissolution of the Parliament, of the National Assembly. He said, like, I threw them a grenade in the legs, and let's see what they're going to do about it. And like this guy, he's coming from the banking industry, and it looks like he kind of played like as if he was some kind of trader, like just trying to play it all at the same time to see if he's going to win or if it's going to break. And just so you can understand more the context, like France is a mix of presidential and parliamentary regime. So the president does have a lot of power, contrarily to many presidents in Europe, who are just like really symbolic role. In France, the president has a lot of power, but also the prime minister as well. And the prime minister, who's the lead of the head of the government, this prime minister has to be of the same political party than the majority at the National Assembly. So this is what is important to understand then why it's quite of a chaotic situation right now in France. Sorry, I have a problem with my document. Okay. So yeah, I mean, like the legislative elections in France, it's like 2 rounds, and it's a winner takes all system. So we have a first round with like usually like 4, 5, 6, 7 like runners, and only 2 or 3 the first 2 or 3 who arrive first then qualify for the second round, and then whoever gets the majority of votes for the second round wins the seat at the parliament. So what happened during those legislative elections, like end of June, early July, is that at the first during the first round is the far right who won, let's say, in terms of who arrived first. They got like 30% of the votes, 34% of the votes. So a lot of the candidates of this far right party qualified for the second round, but they didn't win so much for the second round because, as I will explain later, basically like everyone that didn't vote far right for the first round kind of voted against the far right and for whichever candidate during the second round. So that's why the far right didn't get in power really after all. But they still, at the end of those elections, like during the second round, they still arrived first in terms of like numbers of votes, with over 10 million votes for them. And then the left bloc arrived second in terms of like number of votes, but they actually won more seats than the far right or Macron's party. So now we have a National Assembly with the left bloc, which was a coalition of different left parties. So this left bloc has around like 200 MPs, which is a relative majority, but not an absolute majority, because you need 289 MPs for an absolute majority. So it's a very weird situation, because the French system has been, like since the 80s, the constitution we currently have has been shaped so the president and the National Assembly are from the same party. But when it's not the case, we call that cohabitation. And in those cases, like there's no really any written rule about what's happening. And also, it's even more singular right now, the situation, because the left doesn't have an absolute majority. It won't be able to govern on its own. And currently, Macron is just trying to find a way to not nominate a prime minister coming from that left bloc. So we don't really know what's going to happen. Maybe he's going to ally with the right wing, not far right, but the right wing party, or maybe he's going to split the left bloc. We'll see. So yeah, a point about the increasing domination of the far right and the risk for the future from a radical feminist point of view. Okay, I'm just going to take a few minutes to introduce the main far right party in France, which is called Rassemblement National. So Rassemblement National it's a new name that has been decided since 2018, but it's just a new name of a decade-old party in France called Front National. And Front National was created in 1972 by a French man called Jean-Marie Le Pen. And so it was created by this guy and a mix of men literally coming from the Waffen-SS, so the military branch of Nazi Germany in the 40s. So there were men coming from Waffen-SS circles, and also a lot of men coming from far-right terrorist groups who were against the independence of Algeria. Because as you know, French used to be a big colonial empire, and there was a very bloody decolonization process for Algeria in the 60s. And a lot of far-right groups in France didn't want Algeria to be independent. And I do have to say, still today, it's a very important line of of far-right sentiments still today. You know, like France is still pretty much like hangover from the decolonization, let's be honest. Like there's a lot of racism coming from there. So under Jean-Marie Le Pen, the party Front National had already started to be popular, and this popularity was based on a very explicit and very explicit and traditional far-right rhetoric. So anything you can think about far-right rhetoric, like racism, anti-Semitism, misogyny, homophobia, French nationalism, all of this was very explicit under this Jean-Marie Le Pen. Many representatives of the party, including Jean-Marie Le Pen himself, have been over the decades condemned by the justice for anti-Semitic or racial hatred. But the party has kind of took a new mask since one of his daughter, Marine Le Pen, took the lead of the party since 2011. She developed a strategy of normalization by giving a more professional appearance of the party and by removing the less politically acceptable, parts of the rhetoric. And she instead focused on what's seen as more politically acceptable, let's say, in our Western society and in the media. So she's focusing on immigration and what she calls Islamization of France. She's been representing the party for the presidential elections over the past 3 presidential elections, if I'm not mistaken. And she's been getting more and more success. And yeah, this time there was a new figure of the far right that emerged with a young man called Jordan Bardella. He's been an activist for the Front National for a while, and also he's dating one of the women of the Le Pen family. I can't remember the detail exactly, but yeah, so he's been the figure of those European elections, and he had a lot of success as a man, let's be honest. And also he's been using a lot of social media like TikTok. So yeah, he was really like the mainstream, a lot of mainstream media really loved him. So that's for the background. And the increase of the far right party, like this Rassemblement National, just so you can see, like in 2012, during the election, the legislative election, there was only 2 MPs from the far right party, only 8 when Macron arrived in power in 2017. And now we have 143 just coming from that party, 143 MP, and it gets to a bit higher number with the allies the party had during this election. So the increase has largely taken place during Macron's presidency. I mean, I don't have the time to discuss so much in details about what are the factors of this far right vote, because it's a long discussion to have, but a lot of the rise of the far right happened during Macron. And it's been very scary how this increase has been very radical and very fast. You know, just a few years, bam, now we have like the far right is the first political force in France, let's be honest. And just to add about the chaos that's been happening in France in June is like when Macron announced the dissolution of the parliament, like during the few weeks of campaign, I do have to say, like, it's been very scary. Like a lot of people, and including myself, like we really thought that the far right was going to win. And if the far right wins, that there was going to be a kind of civil war, because in France, I think it's not just France, but at least what I know is France, like when you put the far right in power, you're not just putting the far right in the institution, like you're not giving the institutional power to the far right. In France, we have openly neo-fascist and neo-Nazi militias, so group of armed men in big cities, but also in the countryside, who train, who organize, and even before those elections, like they do what we call like ratonnade. So, like for example, in Lyon, it's very famous that those far right militias, in the night, for example, they go like 10, 20, 30 of them, and they try to find some Arabic man or black man or even woman and beat them up. So this was already happening before the elections, but now it's during the election, during the campaign. Honestly, all of the violence you can think of has exploded. And honestly, it didn't, like the violence didn't come only from the far right. Like there's been elements of like violence coming from all sides of the political, but a lot of like the far right violence has really exploded. There's been an explosion of anti-Arab and anti-Black racism. So a lot of verbal attacks, physical attacks, murder attempts, murders even. A lot of it has been targeted against women, especially Muslim women. A lot of Muslim women have received a lot of physical violence. And there's been homophobic violence as well. Like a leader of one of the main far-right militia, he was involved in the beating up of a gay man, and he was arrested by the police and so on. And he said to the police that he couldn't wait for the far-right party to arrive at government, so then he can beat up some more fags whenever the far right is in government. And the main far right party, Rassemblement National, when they've been asked about all this violence, the main representatives, they haven't denounced the violence. They've only minimized or denied, or they just said that they didn't see what was wrong in some of the verbal attacks that's been happening. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot more details, but I don't want to take so much time. So yeah, like what are the stakes for radical feminists in all this chaotic episode, not just episode, to be honest, like this chaotic environment in France. I mean, in France, it's not like the UK. Like, we don't really have an actual like gender critical or even radical feminist movement, really. Like, I think it's even worse today than it was a few years ago, because the few groups who've tried to do things in real life, in the public space, we've received a lot of violence from trans activists. So some groups have stopped doing public actions. Also, about the far right issue has been very divisive in the radical feminists networks that were existing, because in France, publicly, since a few years, there's only two main women who've talked about trans activism, and they've been very divisive for radical feminists, because, I mean, I'm going to be honest, one of them today has literally publicly on Twitter celebrated the victories of the far right. So, like, those two women who've been very public about criticizing trans activism, they are the only face of the critique against trans activism, let's say, and those women have now completely aligned with the far right. Initially, their argument was that they were using any media who were platforming them, so because left-wing media was canceling them, then they didn't mind going to right-wing or far right-wing media. And their argument, which I personally even disagree with, but the argument was to say, yeah, like, no one is here to platform us, so we do what we can. But today, it's not even that level. Like, today is, like, one of them, really, she is espousing ideologically all the themes of the far right. She has now even moved away from feminism. And she's even espousing, like, the rhetoric of, like, complementarity between women and men. And she's said a lot of very racist things, openly racist things in general, but also against women of color as well. And yeah, celebrating the win of the far right. So this has been a very big problem for grassroots activists, because, yeah, I mean, on the field, like, I've met a lot of radical feminists who can't be open about criticizing trans activism, but yeah, I mean, on the grassroots level, all the radical feminists, we disagree with the strategy of those two women of aligning with the far right. Like, we are horrified by it, and of course, like, there's a wider patriarchal context that prevents us from talking publicly about it, but the strategy of these two women have made it even harder for a lot of us to speak or to even organize, because the theme of the critique of trans activism is now completely seen as a far right thing in France, and it's not just propaganda. Let's be honest. Today, I can't just say it's a lie, because there are facts about it, sadly. So yeah, we are stuck because, of course, the left wing is not satisfactory at all. Like, I'm gonna say it, like, I personally voted for the left wing because, in spite of all the problems, I prefer to fight against a left wing government than against a far right government. But the left is terrible. It's been completely co-opted by transgenderism, and it can't be really defended on that side of things, that's for sure.
What impact are the French elections going to have on the European Union?
I mean, if the far right had been elected, it would have been a very big thing on the European Union, because the far right in France, like, today, it doesn't say that it wants to get out of European Union, but it's very, like, confrontational about especially, like, social policies and policies around immigration, although European Union is already quite hard on immigration these days, but it's not hard enough for the far right. But also actually about the far right, the far right in France, what we can say is that their allies in Europe are Hungary of Viktor Orban, Poland, far right Poland, Italy as well, the far right government in Italy, and all of the European Union bills that tried to pass in European Parliament about, for example, condemning Poland about anti-abortion law, or condemning Hungary about anti-homosexual law, or Italy. All of this, the French far right has been against condemning any of that. So they've shown their true colors on many levels, on the European level